The blue lights hit your rearview mirror, and instantly your entire body changes. Your hands tighten on the steering wheel. Your breathing gets shorter. You start replaying every mile you drove in the last 10 minutes, trying to figure out what you did wrong. Was it speeding? A lane change? A broken tail light you didn't know about? Then the officer walks up slowly, flashlight aimed directly into the vehicle, even though they already know exactly where your eyes are. They ask for license and registration. Their voice sounds calm, yours probably doesn't. A few minutes later comes the sentence that changes the entire stop. "I need to pat you down." Now everything feels different. Have you ever been pulled over and felt like the situation suddenly escalated for no clear reason, or felt pressured to agree to something because you were nervous and didn't know what would happen if you said no? Tell me your experience in the comments, because a lot of drivers go through situations they later realize were far more serious than they first understood. And stay with me through this entire explanation, because later I'm going to explain one mistake people make during pat-downs that officers notice immediately, and it changes the entire tone of the stop. Most drivers completely misunderstand what a pat-down actually is, and honestly, police know that. That confusion matters because the average person hears pat-down and thinks they have no choice. They think refusing automatically means arrest. They think compliance will make everything easier. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it absolutely does not. The first thing you need to understand is that a pat-down is not supposed to be a fishing expedition. At least legally, that's not what it is supposed to be. A pat-down, often called a frisk, is generally supposed to be about weapons, officer safety. That's the justification. Not evidence hunting, not "let me see what I can find." But roadside reality is more complicated than courtroom language, and that's where people get caught off guard. Because once an officer says they want to pat you down, most drivers panic internally and start making terrible decisions within seconds. They begin over-explaining. Their voice shakes. They start reaching around. Some nervously laugh. Some try to act overly tough. Others immediately blurt out random information nobody asked for. "I swear, I don't have anything. I'm not dangerous. I've never been arrested. There's nothing illegal in here." Notice something? None of those statements actually help. In fact, experienced officers often pay more attention to behavior than words. That part matters more than people realize. A veteran officer has probably conducted thousands of traffic stops. They are constantly observing timing, movement, eye contact, hesitation, breathing, hand placement, speech patterns, and emotional shifts. They notice when someone suddenly becomes too cooperative or strangely defensive. They notice when a driver keeps touching pockets. They notice when someone answers questions too quickly. They notice silence too. And here's the uncomfortable truth a lot of people do not want to hear. Nervousness alone does not make you suspicious, because almost everybody is nervous during traffic stops. Officers know that. But unusual nervousness combined with inconsistent behavior absolutely changes how they view the encounter. That's why the exact words you use when they say, "I need to pat you down," matter so much. The simple script is this: "Officer, I do not consent to any searches, but I will not resist." That sentence is powerful for several reasons. First, it stays calm. Second, it does not physically interfere. Third, it clearly establishes lack of consent. And fourth, it avoids one of the biggest mistakes drivers make, turning the stop into an emotional argument. A lot of people online fantasize about roadside legal debates. They imagine themselves delivering dramatic constitutional speeches next to the highway while traffic flies by at 70 miles per hour. That is not reality. The side of the road is not a courtroom. It is not YouTube comment section law school. It is a tense environment where officers are making quick judgments and drivers are often operating emotionally instead of strategically. You do not want to sound aggressive. You do not want to sound terrified. You do not want to sound sarcastic. And you definitely do not want to physically pull away during a pat-down. That last mistake changes stops fast. Some drivers think if they twist away slightly or move their arm, they are asserting rights. Officers often interpret that movement as potential resistance or concealment behavior. Once physical uncertainty enters the interaction, the entire stop can escalate in seconds. Think about the officer's perspective for a moment. They do not know you. They do not know your intentions. They do not know if you are armed. They do not know if you are calm or about to panic. Traffic stops are unpredictable. Officers are trained to expect sudden violence even during routine encounters. Whether people like hearing that or not, it affects how police interpret movement and hesitation. That does not mean every officer acts appropriately. Some absolutely overstep. Some push boundaries. Some intentionally use pressure tactics. But understanding police psychology helps you avoid making situations worse accidentally. Now here is where things get complicated legally and practically. A lot of drivers think saying, "I do not consent," magically prevents a search. It doesn't. That phrase is important because it preserves your position legally and verbally, but it does not physically stop an officer from doing what they already decided to do. That distinction matters. If an officer believes they have legal grounds to frisk you, they may proceed whether you consent or not. The difference is that you did not voluntarily authorize it. And believe it or not, officers often phrase requests in ways that sound optional, even when the situation already feels mandatory. "Mind if I check real quick? You don't have any weapons on you, right? You care if I pat you down? Just for my safety." Those phrases sound casual on purpose. Many people comply automatically because they fear looking suspicious if they hesitate. That psychological pressure is incredibly effective. Humans naturally want authority figures to approve of them, especially during stressful encounters. That is why calm wording matters more than attitude. Notice the script again. "Officer, I do not consent to any searches, but I will not resist." No insults, no threats, no legal lecture, no chest puffing, just clarity. And there is another reason this works better than emotional reactions. Officers hear hostility all day long. Yelling rarely impresses anybody roadside. Calmness, however, changes dynamics. A calm driver is harder to justify escalating against unless there is some other factor involved. Now let's talk about one of the strangest moments that happens during pat-down situations. Silence. Not legal silence, human silence. That awkward pause after you refuse consent. A lot of drivers are not prepared for it. The officer looks at them, the driver looks forward, cars rush by outside. Nobody says anything for 2 or 3 seconds. Those seconds feel incredibly long, and many drivers crack emotionally during that silence. They start talking just to relieve tension. "I mean, I don't have anything anyway. You can search if you want. I'm just nervous. I've had bad experiences before." Again, unnecessary talking creates unnecessary risk. People often reveal information accidentally because silence feels uncomfortable. Experienced investigators understand this extremely well. Silence creates pressure. Humans naturally try to fill conversational gaps. That is one reason repeated questioning happens during stops. An officer may ask the same thing multiple ways, not because they didn't hear you, but because they are watching consistency. "Where are you coming from?" "So you were at your friend's place?" "How long were you there?" "What time did you leave?" The content matters, but behavior matters too. Do you suddenly change details? Do you become defensive? Do you answer too aggressively? Do you freeze before simple questions? Drivers underestimate how much observation occurs during ordinary conversation. Now let's discuss another reality people rarely talk about honestly. Sometimes officers already suspect more than they are saying. The traffic violation may simply be the reason for the stop, not the reason for the interest. Maybe they think the car matches a description. Maybe they noticed movements before approaching. Maybe they believe occupants are hiding something. Maybe they smell alcohol or marijuana. Maybe they think the driver is impaired. Maybe dispatch flagged something connected to the vehicle. Drivers often think the stop is only about speeding because that is what they were told initially. Meanwhile, the officer's mental checklist may already be much larger. That is why tone shifts happen. You have probably seen this before. At first, the officer sounds casual, then suddenly, "Step out of the vehicle." Now the atmosphere changes immediately. And legally, in many situations, officers can order drivers out during traffic stops. A lot of people do not realize that. They think remaining inside the car is their choice. Then they become argumentative at exactly the wrong moment. Again, this does not mean surrender every right you have. It means understanding the difference between strategic compliance and emotional resistance. There is a huge difference. One of the worst mistakes drivers make is confusing politeness with weakness. Calm compliance with lawful commands while verbally declining consent is often smarter than emotional defiance, because roadside escalation rarely benefits drivers. Now let me explain a tactic officers sometimes use that catches people completely off guard. Document delay. An officer takes your license and registration and simply holds on to them longer than expected. Then, more conversation starts. Where are you headed tonight? You live around here? What's in the back seat? Anybody else in the vehicle got ID? Many drivers think these questions are casual conversation. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they absolutely are not. The longer the interaction continues, the more opportunities there are for inconsistent statements, visible nervousness, contradictory passenger answers, or consent requests. Passengers become extremely important during these moments, and this is where traffic stops get psychologically messy. One passenger wants to stay silent, another wants to cooperate, a third starts talking too much because they think friendliness helps. Meanwhile, officers may separate stories intentionally. Where are you guys coming from? How long have you known each other? Who owns the vehicle? People do not realize how often passengers accidentally create suspicion through small inconsistencies that mean nothing in ordinary life. One person says dinner ended at 10, another says 11. One says they came directly home, another mentions stopping at a gas station. Suddenly, officers pay closer attention. Now let's go back specifically to the pat-down itself, because there is a dangerous myth floating around online that needs to die. Some people believe if an officer pats them down improperly, they should physically stop the officer in real time. Terrible idea. Roadside disputes about legality should not become physical contests. Even if an officer exceeds lawful limits, resisting physically can escalate danger immediately. And remember something important. Officers are also evaluating whether someone may flee, fight, or conceal weapons. Sudden movements during a frisk are among the fastest ways to increase tension. The safer approach is verbal clarity without physical resistance. That matters more than internet bravado. Now, there is another phrase people misuse constantly during stops. Am I being detained? People repeat that line like it is magic because they heard it online. But context matters. During a traffic stop, yes, you are generally detained temporarily. The officer already stopped your vehicle. Repeating, "Am I being detained?" 15 times in an aggressive tone usually does not create the dramatic legal moment people imagine. In fact, repetitive confrontation often changes officer perception negatively. You know what works better? Direct, calm questions. Officer, am I free to leave? Officer, is there a reason for the pat-down? Officer, are you ordering me to step out? Simple, controlled, clear. Now let's talk about body language, because this part is massively underestimated. People think rights are only verbal. They are not. Your movements communicate constantly, fast-reaching, turning suddenly, digging through compartments before instructed, touching waistband areas, looking repeatedly toward hidden areas. All of that affects how officers interpret risk. Even innocent actions can appear suspicious depending on timing. Imagine this scenario. The officer says, "Do you have any weapons?" The driver immediately reaches toward their pocket, saying, "No." That single movement can trigger instant alarm. This is why experienced drivers narrate movements calmly. My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm reaching for registration now. My insurance card is in the glove box. Clear communication reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is what creates tension during traffic stops more than almost anything else. Now here comes the mistake I mentioned earlier that officers notice immediately: overacting calmness. This surprises people. Some drivers become so focused on appearing calm that they behave unnaturally robotic. Their speech becomes rehearsed. Their tone becomes stiff. Every sentence sounds copied from a legal advice video. Officers notice authenticity. Humans notice authenticity. If you sound like you are performing instead of communicating, suspicion sometimes increases rather than decreases. That does not mean babble nervously. It means stay natural. A calm, normal tone is far more effective than sounding like you memorized courtroom dialogue from the internet. And honestly, officers have heard those scripts before anyway. Now let's address another uncomfortable reality. Some officers use conversational pressure intentionally. They may act friendly one moment and stern the next. That sudden tone shift is not random. Psychologically, people reveal more information when emotional rhythm changes unexpectedly. A driver relaxes slightly during friendly conversation, then becomes anxious when the officer's tone hardens. You seem nervous. Why are your hands shaking? You got something illegal in the car? At that moment, many innocent people panic because they think nervousness itself proves guilt. It doesn't. But panicked behavior absolutely changes interactions. And there is something else many drivers misunderstand. Officers are not only evaluating criminal behavior, they are evaluating unpredictability. An innocent but emotionally unstable person can still create safety concerns during a stop. That is why emotional control matters so much. Not fake toughness, not fake confidence. Control. Now let's talk about the phrase officers often use during pat-down situations. For my safety. Most drivers hear that and immediately feel trapped. Because what are you supposed to say? Nobody wants to sound anti-safety. Nobody wants to appear threatening. That phrasing is powerful psychologically because it frames resistance as danger. And this is exactly why calm, non-consent language matters instead of emotional argument. You are not trying to win roadside. You are trying to avoid unnecessary escalation while protecting yourself verbally and behaviorally. Those are different goals. One thing that surprises people is how often small driver mistakes create bigger investigations unintentionally. Expired insurance card. Open alcohol container forgotten in back seat. Prescription bottle without labeling. Passenger blurting out something suspicious as a joke. Unpaid warrant the driver forgot existed. Routine stops evolve quickly, and once tension increases, people stop thinking clearly. That is when bad decisions happen. People consent to searches they never intended to allow. People argue emotionally. People lie unnecessarily. People physically interfere. People make sarcastic comments. People try to outsmart officers conversationally. Usually that ends badly. Now there is another roadside reality hardly anyone discusses honestly. The longer you talk, the more material exists to interpret later. That matters legally and practically. Many drivers think they can talk their way out of suspicion through non-stop explanation. Sometimes excessive explanation has the opposite effect because details become inconsistent over time. Short, truthful responses are usually safer than nervous storytelling. And notice I said truthful, because lying during police interactions creates enormous risks that people underestimate. Once an officer believes a driver is dishonest, everything changes. Credibility collapses, tone changes, scrutiny increases. Even small lies damage situations. Have you had anything to drink tonight? A driver who says, absolutely not, despite having one beer hours earlier, may think they are avoiding trouble. But if the officer later smells alcohol or observes something inconsistent, the issue becomes larger than it originally was. Now let's return to pat-downs specifically. A lawful frisk is generally supposed to focus on weapons detection, not exploratory evidence searching. But roadside reality becomes complicated when officers claim they felt something suspicious during the frisk. This is where people start arguing physically or verbally because they think the search exceeded limits. Again, Roadside confrontation rarely helps. Document mentally, stay calm, avoid resistance. Handle disputes later through legal channels if necessary. I know that sounds unsatisfying to some people because emotionally, everyone imagines dramatic moments of standing their ground perfectly under pressure. Real life is messier. Adrenaline changes people. Even confident individuals become forgetful, shaky, emotional, or overly talkative during police encounters. That is normal human behavior, and officers know it. That is why pauses, silence, repeated questions, and observation are so important during stops. Here is another situation that catches drivers off guard. The officer returns documents but continues standing there talking. Many people assume they still cannot leave because the interaction feels authoritative. Others start walking away too aggressively and create awkward tension. This is why asking clearly matters. Officer, am I free to go? Simple, respectful, direct. And if the answer becomes vague, that itself tells you something important about the interaction. Now let's discuss passengers for a minute, because passengers often make situations dramatically worse without realizing it. One passenger starts filming aggressively while yelling legal phrases. Another begins searching bags suddenly. Another interrupts constantly. Another jokes about drugs or weapons. Officers interpret group behavior collectively during tense moments, and group emotional energy spreads fast. A calm driver can become agitated because passengers panic. Passengers become nervous because officers change tone. Suddenly, everybody is talking over each other. That chaos increases uncertainty for everyone involved. Now, some viewers may wonder whether refusing consent automatically makes officers suspicious. Honestly, sometimes yes. But many officers also expect informed drivers to decline searches. Refusal alone is not the same thing as guilt. The key difference is behavior surrounding the refusal. Calm refusal feels different from combative refusal, and experienced officers absolutely notice that distinction. There is another thing drivers misunderstand badly. Being polite does not mean surrendering rights. People think they must choose between aggressive defiance and total submission. Real-world roadside interactions are more nuanced than that. You can be respectful while declining consent. You can comply physically while remaining verbally clear. You can stay calm while protecting yourself. That balance matters. And one final thing about pat-downs that deserves serious attention. Never forget the emotional pressure of authority. Uniforms affect people psychologically. Lights affect people psychologically. Commands affect people psychologically. Most citizens are not trained for high-pressure investigative conversations. Officers are. That imbalance is real, which means your biggest advantage during a stop is not clever legal language. It is emotional discipline. Because panic creates mistakes, ego creates mistakes, fear creates mistakes, anger creates mistakes. The drivers who usually navigate stops best are not necessarily the loudest or most confrontational. They are the ones who remain controlled, even when the atmosphere becomes uncomfortable. So if an officer ever says, "I need to pat you down," remember the goal is not to win a roadside argument. The goal is to stay safe, stay clear, avoid escalating physically, and avoid talking yourself into deeper problems. Officer, I do not consent to any searches, but I will not resist. Then pay attention to everything else happening around you. The pauses, the tone shifts, the repeated questions, the pressure, the silence. Because traffic stops are rarely only about words. Most of the time, the entire encounter is really about behavior, perception, uncertainty, and who loses emotional control first. And that is exactly why so many ordinary drivers walk away from stops hours later, replaying every second in their head, realizing the moment things changed was not when the officer turned on the lights. It was when stress took over and they stopped thinking clearly.